It was an ordinary evening when Mrs. Ruby Owens, an elderly black woman, was on her way home, never suspecting the nightmare waiting for her. Suddenly, a group of firefighters began taunting and cruelly spraying her with icy water, laughing as she struggled. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Don't miss the shocking outcome. Watch until the end. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment on where you're watching from. It was an evening like any other. The streets were quiet as the day gave way to dusk, painting the skies with the last streaks of orange and purple. Mrs. Ruby Owens, a 70-year-old black woman, felt the weight of her age and the weariness of a long day settle upon her as she made her way home. She pushed herself through each step, her hands slightly trembling, though she tried to ignore it. She had always prided herself on her independence, refusing to let her years slow her down more than necessary. Tonight, she walked with her cane in one hand and clutched her small handbag tightly with the other. Her wrinkled face softened as she took in the familiar route, where the quiet neighborhoods reminded her of the place she had lived her whole life. However, as she neared a street corner, she noticed a group of firefighters gathered around a fire hydrant, their loud voices carrying through the stillness. She didn't pay them much attention at first, continuing on her path, but the closer she got, the clearer their mocking laughter and voices became. Mrs. Owens felt a chill run down her spine as she sensed the atmosphere shift. She could feel their gazes on her, a scrutiny that made her uncomfortable and wary. One of the men, dressed in the dark uniform of a firefighter, turned his gaze directly toward her. She tried to hold her head high, pretending not to notice, but his gaze was piercing, filled with something she couldn't quite understand but didn't like. Another firefighter elbowed him, nodding in her direction with a smirk. Their laughter followed. "Hey, Grandma, you look like you could use a shower," one of the men shouted, his voice dripping with mocking cruelty. Mrs. Owens froze. She didn't know if she should respond or just walk faster, but something in her gut told her to ignore them. She held her head a little higher and resumed her slow, steady walk, keeping her eyes forward. But the men were not satisfied with her silence. Another firefighter called out, "Aw, she's not even going to say thank you. That's rude, old lady." She kept walking, but her heart began to pound. She was almost past them, almost out of their line of sight when she heard the unmistakable sound of water blasting out of a hose. Her instinct kicked in, and she turned her head just in time to see the firefighters aiming the high-pressure hose directly at her. Before she could even react, the blast of water hit her full force, knocking her off her feet. The icy, powerful stream pounded against her frail body, sending shockwaves of pain through her joints. The sheer force pushed her backward, and she stumbled, dropping her cane as she tried to shield her face from the freezing water. The cold was unbearable, cutting through her thin clothes, and her breath came in gasps as the water seemed to drain the air from her lungs. "Look at her. She can barely stand up," one of the firefighters jeered, laughing alongside his companions as they continued to hold the stream of water on her. "Bet she's regretting that walk now." Mrs. Owens struggled to get up, but the water was relentless, pinning her down with its force. She could feel bruises forming, and her bones ached with every second she was exposed to the unyielding stream. She tried to shout for help, but the water drowned her voice, forcing her to swallow icy gulps that burned her throat. Her hands scrambled along the wet concrete, searching for anything to grip onto, but her fingers only met the cold, unyielding pavement. The laughter from the firefighters cut through the roar of the water. They seemed to take pleasure in her suffering, their faces twisted with cruel amusement. One of them casually mentioned something about putting out the old flames, and the others howled with laughter. Each word stung, a fresh blow to her spirit. Mrs. Owens couldn't believe this was happening to her. She had faced many challenges in her life, but nothing like this, nothing so cruel, so unprovoked. Her body began to weaken under the relentless pressure of the water, and she felt a creeping despair fill her heart. Finally, just when she thought she couldn't take another moment, the water stopped. She lay on the ground, soaked and shivering, her entire body throbbing in pain. Her hands, numb from the cold, shook uncontrollably as she tried to gather herself. Slowly, she began to sit up, her mind racing with disbelief and shame. One of the firefighters stepped forward, grinning as he towered over her. "Guess you got your shower, huh? You're welcome." The others laughed again, their voices echoing through the empty street. Mrs. Owens felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she knew there was nothing she could do. She was alone, vulnerable, and these men held all the power. She had been humiliated, stripped of her dignity and left to suffer on the ground, with her spirit broken but her pride still clinging to survival. As she sat there, catching her breath and trying to muster the strength to stand, she noticed a figure in the distance. The familiar silhouette brought a flood of relief. It was her son, Daryl, the man she had raised with love and pride, now an esteemed captain in the local police force. She could see the moment he spotted her on the ground, his steps faltering, his eyes widening in shock and anger. He rushed toward her, and as he got closer, the firefighters noticed his approach. They exchanged glances, some looking amused, while others looked a bit uneasy. But none of them moved to help her. To them, she was nothing but a helpless old woman, and now, to their surprise, a helpless old woman with a son who was about to make them face the consequences of their cruelty. As Captain Daryl Owens approached, his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anger. The sight of his mother, frail and soaked, struggling to sit up on the ground, sent a chill through his veins. He had seen his fair share of injustice and cruelty in his years as a police officer, but nothing had prepared him for the gut-wrenching reality of watching his own mother become a target. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside her and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but trembling with barely contained fury. Her clothes clung to her, soaked through and through, and her face was a mask of exhaustion and pain. "Daryl," she whispered, her voice weak but relieved. The mere presence of her son gave her a glimmer of strength, something to hold on to in this nightmare. They turned the hose on me." He clenched his jaw, feeling his muscles tense with each word. Daryl looked up, his sharp gaze piercing through the smug faces of the firefighters standing nearby. They watched with smirks, unbothered by the damage they had caused. The leader of the group, a tall man with a rough face and a hardened grin, folded his arms across his chest, sizing up Daryl as though he were an inconvenience. Daryl rose to his full height, standing between his mother and the men who had dared to humiliate her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was low, steady, and laced with barely restrained rage. The firefighters exchanged glances, amused rather than intimidated. The tall one shrugged, giving Daryl a casual, dismissive smirk. "Relax, officer. We were just helping her cool off," he said, gesturing to the hose with a shrug. Daryl narrowed his eyes. He reached into his pocket, retrieving his police badge and holding it up for them to see. "I'm not just an officer," he said, his voice turning icier with each word. "I'm Captain Owens, and this woman is my mother. Your help was nothing but harassment. I'm ordering you to stop this nonsense immediately." For a brief moment, the firefighters' smiles faded. They glanced uneasily at each other, the weight of Daryl's position finally sinking in. But the tall man, seemingly the leader, quickly shook off his momentary hesitation and let out a mocking laugh. "Captain, huh? Well, congratulations, but your badge doesn't mean much here," he sneered, stepping forward until he was almost nose to nose with Daryl. "You might be the boss in a police station, but out here, we handle things our way." Daryl held his ground, refusing to back down. "If you don't stop now, you'll be answering for this in front of more than just me. Assaulting a civilian, especially an elderly woman, is a serious crime. I'll make sure every one of you faces consequences." The other firefighters shifted uncomfortably, some muttering under their breath. But the leader wasn't having it. He looked over his shoulder, nodding to his comrades with a smirk. "You hear that, boys? Captain here wants to teach us a lesson." One of the other men chuckled, while another gave Daryl a mocking salute. The group seemed emboldened, feeding off each other's defiance. The tall man turned back to Daryl, his eyes narrowing with a gleam of cruelty. "Tell you what, Captain, why don't you get off your high horse and see how we handle people like you?" Before Daryl could react, the tall firefighter shoved him hard, making him stumble backward. Mrs. Owens gasped, trying to reach out for her son, but her strength was barely enough to keep herself upright. Daryl quickly steadied himself, his jaw set in anger, but the group of firefighters advanced on him. "Back off," he barked, his voice rising as he held up his hands, signaling for them to stop. But they ignored him, closing in with sneering faces and mocking gestures. Without warning, the leader lunged at him, and before Daryl could dodge, the other firefighters joined in. They grabbed him, roughly, holding his arms behind his back. He struggled, trying to break free, but their combined strength was overwhelming. They taunted him, throwing insults and mocking his authority as he fought against their grip. "Look at the big, tough captain now," one of them jeered, yanking him to his knees. The leader grabbed the hose again, giving a twisted smile as he pointed it directly at Daryl. "Let's see how the captain likes a taste of his own medicine," he said, flipping on the water full blast. A freezing torrent of water hit Daryl square in the chest, the force of it knocking the air from his lungs and drenching him instantly. The ice-cold water battered his face, his eyes stinging as he struggled to turn his head away from the relentless stream. The firefighters laughed, their voices blending with the roar of the water, drowning out his gasps for air. Each second felt like an eternity. The water was merciless, slamming into him with a pressure that bruised his skin and made it nearly impossible to move. Daryl could feel his body weakening, his muscles straining to withstand the force. His mother's voice, faint and desperate, reached his ears, but he couldn't respond, couldn't reassure her. He was completely at their mercy. The laughter around him only grew louder, feeding off his helplessness. "Some captain you are," one of the men shouted, his voice thick with derision. But in the midst of the pain and humiliation, Daryl's resolve hardened. He had dealt with men like these before. Cowards who hid behind their numbers, their authority, their cruelty. His mind raced with thoughts of how he would hold them accountable, make them face justice for what they were doing to him and his mother. As the water finally ceased, Daryl collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. His body felt numb, his skin bruised and tingling from the cold. He lay there, soaked and shivering, as the firefighters stood over him, sneering down at his exhausted form. "Not so tough now, are you, Captain?" the leader taunted, nudging him with his boot. Darryl struggled to his feet, every muscle protesting in agony. But he managed to stand, his gaze locked on the man who had humiliated him and his mother. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "You will face consequences for this." The leader laughed, unaffected by the threat. "Big words for a man who can barely stand," he scoffed, turning his back on Darryl. The others followed suit, their amusement still evident as they walked away, leaving Darryl and his mother alone. Darryl turned back to Mrs. Owens, his heart breaking as he saw her slumped over, drenched and shivering. He knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, it's over now," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. They had both suffered, and he knew that this was just the beginning of their fight for justice. Together, they struggled to their feet, leaning on each other for support. The quiet street now seemed to echo with the memory of cruelty and pain, but Darryl's resolve was unshaken. He would not let this stand. One way or another, these men would pay for what they had done. Darryl felt every inch of his body protesting as he slowly helped his mother along the street. She leaned heavily on him, her frail form shivering in the damp, cold air, and he could feel the weakness in her steps. The pain in his own muscles from the brutal assault was a reminder of the humiliation they had both suffered, but he pushed through it, focusing only on getting her to safety. They had only managed a few steps when a jeering voice called from behind them. "Hey, Captain, where are you going? We're not done here." Darryl's heart sank as he glanced back to see the firefighters coming toward them again, their faces twisted with mockery and anger. He held his mother close, his body tensing as he prepared to defend them both. The group of firefighters closed in, their leader at the front, a sneer on his face as he looked Darryl up and down. "I thought you wanted to teach us a lesson, Captain," the leader taunted, stepping closer. "Or did the hose shut you up?" Darryl gritted his teeth, keeping his mother shielded behind him as best as he could. "You've done enough damage," he replied, his voice steady despite the pain coursing through him. "Leave us alone." But his words only seemed to amuse them. The leader exchanged glances with his men, and they laughed, emboldened by each other's confidence. Without warning, one of them lunged forward, grabbing Darryl's arm and twisting it behind his back. A sharp pain shot up his shoulder, but he forced himself not to cry out, not to show any weakness. "Let's see how tough you really are, Captain," another firefighter sneered, moving in to hold Darryl's other arm. They restrained him, their grips like iron, pinning him down as he struggled to break free. Mrs. Owens cried out, her voice trembling as she tried to reach for her son. "Stop it! Please, stop!" But her pleas fell on deaf ears as the firefighters continued their assault, ignoring her entirely. With his arms pinned, Darryl was helpless as the leader stepped in front of him, smirking as he brought his fist back. The punch landed hard on Darryl's jaw, sending a fresh wave of pain radiating through his skull. His vision blurred for a moment, but he forced himself to stay focused, determined not to let them see him falter. "Not so brave now, are you?" the leader sneered, landing another punch to Darryl's stomach. He doubled over, gasping for breath, but his resolve only grew stronger with each blow. He knew he couldn't fight back, not with his mother watching, not with these men overpowering him. But the assault didn't stop. The firefighters continued to punch and shove him, their laughter echoing through the empty street. The leader finally stepped back, his smirk widening as he grabbed the fire hose once more, lifting it with a twisted gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Time for another bath, Captain." he said, aiming the nozzle directly at Daryl's face. Before Daryl could brace himself, the blast of icy water struck him, knocking him backward. He stumbled, trying to keep his footing, but the force of the water was too strong. The freezing stream hit him relentlessly, soaking him to the bone and bruising his skin with its relentless pressure. Daryl's mother watched, horror etched on her face as her son was battered by the unforgiving stream of water. She could hardly stand to see him in such pain, but there was nothing she could do, no way to stop the cruelty unfolding before her eyes. The firefighters taunted Daryl, their voices filled with derision as they laughed at his helplessness. "Look at the mighty captain now," one of them shouted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Can't even handle a little water." Daryl could barely keep his eyes open against the force of the water, but he held his ground, refusing to let them break him. He knew that every second he endured brought him closer to justice, closer to the moment when he would make these men answer for their actions. The leader finally turned off the hose, letting Daryl collapse to the ground in a shivering, soaked heap. His body ached, each bruise and cut a reminder of the abuse he had suffered. He could feel his mother's presence beside him, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his shoulder. "Daryl, are you okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing in his ears. He nodded weakly, forcing himself to sit up despite the pain. I'm okay, Mom," he managed, though he knew the toll the attack had taken on him. But the firefighters weren't finished. They stepped forward again, surrounding him and his mother like predators circling their prey. Daryl knew he couldn't protect her alone, but he wouldn't let them see his fear. He raised his chin, meeting their gazes with defiance. "Is that all you've got?" he said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. The leader sneered, crossing his arms as he looked down at Daryl with contempt. "You still think you're in charge here, don't you? Still think you're some big, important captain. But out here, we call the shots." Daryl clenched his fists, his muscles protesting with each movement. "You might think you're untouchable now, but that won't last," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I will make sure every one of you pays for this." The leader scoffed, unimpressed. "Big words for a man lying in the dirt," he said, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a small crack in his confidence. At that moment, one of the other firefighters nudged him, muttering something under his breath. The leader's expression shifted, his sneer faltering as he glanced around. For the first time, they seemed to realize that they might have gone too far, that their actions could have real consequences. "Let's get out of here," the leader muttered, waving for his men to follow. "We've wasted enough time on these two." The firefighters turned and walked away, their laughter fading as they disappeared down the street. Daryl watched them go, his body still trembling with pain and exhaustion, but his mind already working on the next steps. He turned to his mother, helping her to her feet as gently as he could. She clung to him, her strength barely enough to stand, but her resolve just as strong as his own. They had endured the worst, but now they would fight back. They would make sure that no one else suffered at the hands of those men, that no one else was humiliated and hurt as they had been. Together, they began the slow walk home, leaning on each other for support. Each step was a reminder of the pain they had endured, but also a testament to the strength they shared. And as they walked, Daryl knew that their fight had only just begun. Daryl and his mother had barely made it halfway down the block, both of them leaning heavily on each other for support when the sound of tires screeching to a halt caught their attention. Darrell looked up, squinting through his pain and exhaustion, and saw a squad car pull up with 2 uniformed officers jumping out. The sight was both a relief and a reminder of his duty. He was still Captain Owens, and now he had to make sure his mother was safe. The officers, drawn by the commotion and alerted to trouble by nearby residents, rushed toward them. Darrell recognized one of them immediately. Officer Rayner, a young, dependable officer who had joined the force under his mentorship. Rayner's expression turned from surprise to horror as he took in the sight of his captain and Mrs. Owens, both soaked, bruised, and visibly shaken. "Captain Owens, what happened?" Rayner asked, his voice filled with concern as he quickly approached them. Darrell took a deep breath, steadying himself before answering. "Rayner, get my mother to safety first," he instructed, nodding toward Mrs. Owens, who was trembling, still clutching her son's arm for support. Rayner nodded, gently reaching out to Mrs. Owens. "Ma'am, let's get you seated over here," he said, leading her toward the squad car where she could sit and catch her breath. As he turned back, Darrell locked eyes with Rayner, his voice turning hard. "The men who did this, they're a group of firefighters. They attacked my mother and me, used the hose on both of us, and assaulted us," he said, each word carrying the weight of the pain and anger he had held back during the attack. Rayner's eyes darkened with anger. "Where did they go?" he asked, already scanning the surrounding streets, ready to take action. Darrell pointed down the street where he had last seen the group of firefighters walking away, still laughing and smugly confident in their actions. "They headed that way. They're not far." Rayner glanced at his partner, a young officer named Kelly, who had been standing silently, taking in the gravity of the situation. "Kelly, stay with Mrs. Owens. I'm going to go after them," Rayner instructed, and Kelly nodded, moving closer to Mrs. Owens to offer her support. As Rayner took off in pursuit, Darrell steadied himself, determined not to let the pain hold him back. He moved back to his mother's side, reaching out to comfort her, feeling the familiar ache of guilt and helplessness. He had trained his whole life to protect people, yet he hadn't been able to shield his own mother from this cruelty. "Darrell, are you okay?" Mrs. Owens asked softly, her eyes filled with worry. She reached out, brushing his cheek gently, as if trying to ease the hurt in his eyes. He nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a few bruises. The important thing is that you're safe now," he replied, though he knew she could see through the front he was putting up. Her touch was comforting, grounding him as he tried to keep his anger and pain in check. Just then, Rayner's voice crackled over Kelly's radio. "I've located them down the street, requesting backup. These men are resisting arrest," Rayner reported, his voice tense and urgent. Kelly glanced at Darrell, her face mirroring his worry. "Captain, should I call for additional units?" she asked, ready to act. Darrell nodded. "Do it. These men need to be held accountable. No one should be above the law," he said, his voice steady, though his hands shook with anger and the residual pain from the attack. He knew this was just the beginning of a long process, but justice had to start somewhere. Within moments, the sounds of approaching sirens filled the air as more squad cars arrived, responding to the call for backup. Darrell watched as officers poured out of their vehicles, moving quickly down the street in pursuit of the firefighters who had so brazenly attacked him and his mother. He stayed close to Mrs. Owens, reassuring her with his presence as they waited. She clung to his arm, her face etched with both relief and exhaustion. Despite everything, there was a resilience in her eyes, a strength he had always admired. Minutes later, Rayner returned, a firm expression on his face as he approached Darrell. "Captain, we have them in custody. They didn't go quietly, but they're under control now," he reported. Darrell nodded, the weight of the evening's events settling over him. "Good work, Rayner. Make sure they're booked for assault, harassment, and obstruction. I'll make sure the charges stick," he said, his voice filled with resolve. He knew that this wouldn't be an easy case to pursue, but he was determined to see it through to the end. Rayner hesitated, his gaze flicking between Darrell and Mrs. Owens. "Captain, I'm sorry this happened. None of you deserved this," he said, a hint of anger coloring his voice. He had always looked up to Darrell as a leader, a man who stood for justice, and seeing him and his mother in such a state was infuriating. Darrell placed a hand on Rayner's shoulder, his voice steady. "Thank you, Rayner. What matters now is that we make sure they face justice. I won't let them get away with this," he said, his tone unwavering. He turned back to Mrs. Owens, his expression softening as he helped her up from the squad car. "Let's get you home, Mom. You've been through enough tonight," he said, gently guiding her toward another officer's vehicle that would take her back to her house. As they made their way to the car, Darrell felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over him. He had always fought for justice, but this time it was personal. He wouldn't rest until those responsible for this act of cruelty were held accountable, and he would make sure that his mother's pain was not in vain. As he closed the door after helping his mother into the car, he took one last look down the street, where Rayner and the other officers were leading the firefighters away in handcuffs. The men who had laughed and jeered now looked downcast, their confidence replaced by the grim reality of their situation. They had believed themselves untouchable, but they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. With a deep breath, Darrell climbed into the squad car with his mother, feeling a sense of satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready for it. For his mother, for justice, and for every person who had ever suffered at the hands of those who misused their power, he would see this through. The car pulled away from the scene, leaving behind the echoes of a night filled with pain, but also the beginning of a pursuit for justice. The city streets blurred past as Darrell held his mother's hand, silent but determined. They had survived this ordeal together, and now they would face the future with the same resilience. News of the brutal incident involving Captain Darrell Owens and his elderly mother, Mrs. Ruby Owens, spread like wildfire. The following day, newspapers, online media, and even television broadcasts filled with headlines detailing the horrific assault by a group of firefighters. The story captured the city's attention, stirring a collective outrage that had been simmering beneath the surface of the community for years. Photos taken by witnesses showed Mrs. Owens, soaked and shivering, clinging to her son as he lay injured beside her. Social media exploded with images and video snippets that people had recorded during the aftermath, showing the firefighters laughing as they walked away. People were horrified to see the blatant disregard for human dignity, and comments poured in by the thousands, demanding accountability and justice for the Owens family. Within hours, citizens began gathering outside the fire station where the offending firefighters had been stationed. They held signs, chanting slogans condemning racism and demanding justice. The message was clear. The public was done tolerating the abuse of power, and they would not rest until action was taken. At the City Hall, Mayor Ellen Sanders found herself at the center of an unexpected crisis. She had been briefed about the incident early that morning and immediately felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew she had to act swiftly, both to address the public's anger and to prevent further unrest. Mayor Sanders held a press conference later that afternoon, where reporters and community leaders had gathered, waiting anxiously to hear what the city's administration would do. "Good afternoon," she began, her expression solemn as she faced the sea of cameras and microphones. "I want to start by expressing my deepest condolences and support to Captain Darrell Owens and his mother, Mrs. Ruby Owens, who were victims of an unconscionable act of violence. This incident is unacceptable and does not reflect the values of our city." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Effective immediately, I am launching a full investigation into this matter, and we will cooperate with law enforcement to ensure those responsible are held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Furthermore, I am committed to reviewing and reforming our fire department's policies to prevent anything like this from happening again." The press room buzzed with questions as reporters scrambled to ask about the specifics of the investigation, the reforms, and the consequences the firefighters would face. Mayor Sanders held up her hand, signaling for calm. "I know you have many questions," she said, her voice steady, "but I want to assure everyone here and everyone watching that we will see this through. Captain Owens and his mother deserve justice, and we as a community must stand united against any form of abuse or discrimination." Outside, the crowd erupted into applause as they watched the press conference on large screens set up around City Hall. People cheered, feeling a sense of victory that the city's administration was taking a stand. The movement was growing, with people of all backgrounds coming together to demand change. Signs that read "Justice for Ruby" and "End Abuse of Power" waved in the air as people marched through the streets, calling for the immediate termination and arrest of the firefighters involved. Meanwhile, Darrell and his mother watched the broadcast from the hospital, where they were being treated for their injuries. Darrell's jaw still ached from the punches, and his bruises had darkened overnight, but he felt a deep sense of relief knowing that the community was rallying behind them. He glanced at his mother, who lay quietly in her hospital bed, her frail body recovering from the ordeal. "Mom, they're really listening," he said softly, a hint of amazement in his voice. Mrs. Owens smiled weakly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "It's about time, Darrell," she murmured. "People like those men have been getting away with this for too long. I'm glad that our pain is making a difference." He nodded, his heart swelling with pride and determination. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation they had suffered, their experience was sparking something greater, something that could change lives. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every vulnerable person who had ever been mistreated and every community that had been ignored. As they sat in the hospital room, Darrell's phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had heard about what happened. Each message reinforced his resolve to push forward, to use this moment as a catalyst for real, lasting change. He knew that there would be a fight ahead, but he was ready for it. Later that evening, Darrell was visited by Chief Harris, his direct superior and one of the most respected figures in the city's police force. The chief's face was etched with concern and regret as he entered the hospital room, immediately moving to shake Darrell's hand. "Darrell, I'm sorry this happened," Chief Harris said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I've heard everything. Those men, they crossed every line imaginable, and I can promise you they won't get away with it." Darrell nodded, grateful for his chief's support. "Thank you, Chief. I just want to make sure they're held accountable. My mother went through hell because of them, and it could have been anyone else's mother or father." Chief Harris sighed, his face reflecting a mix of anger and disappointment. "You're absolutely right, Daryl. The fire department will be going through a thorough overhaul, and the men involved are already facing criminal charges. The mayor is fully committed to reforming the system, and I'll be backing her every step of the way." Daryl felt a surge of gratitude and pride. Knowing that he had the backing of the chief and the mayor gave him the strength he needed to continue fighting. He squeezed his mother's hand again, feeling the warmth of her grip as she watched Chief Harris with a quiet sense of relief. In the following days, the movement continued to grow, with more citizens joining in to demand justice. Stories of similar incidents began surfacing, each one adding fuel to the fire. People were no longer willing to stay silent, and the city's administration responded by launching investigations into past misconduct cases within both the fire department and the police force. The firefighters involved in the attack on Daryl and his mother faced swift consequences. They were suspended without pay, awaiting trial for multiple charges, including assault, harassment, and abuse of authority. Their once proud reputation tarnished, they now faced the reality of their actions, knowing that the city would no longer turn a blind eye. For Daryl and Mrs. Owens, the days that followed were filled with both healing and reflection. They spent hours talking, processing the trauma, and finding solace in the knowledge that their pain had sparked a movement. The road to recovery would be long, but they took each day as it came, supporting each other with the resilience that had seen them through so much already. As the public outcry continued, Daryl knew that his mother's courage and dignity had made a difference. Their story had struck a chord, reminding people of the importance of standing up for what was right, even when faced with overwhelming odds. And as they moved forward, they knew they had the strength of their community behind them, united in the pursuit of justice and equality. Weeks passed since the horrifying incident, and life slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy for Daryl and his mother, Mrs. Ruby Owens. Their physical wounds were healing, though the bruises still lingered, a reminder of the brutal assault they had endured. The emotional scars, however, would take longer to mend. Yet, each day brought them a step closer to finding peace, thanks to the overwhelming support of their community and the knowledge that justice was finally within reach. The city had continued to rally around them. Vigils, community meetings, and marches filled the streets, with people from all walks of life standing together to demand reform and accountability. Mayor Sanders, as promised, had initiated sweeping changes within the fire department, introducing new policies to prevent any further abuse of power and implementing mandatory sensitivity and anti-discrimination training. She made it clear that any misconduct would be met with swift and serious consequences. The firefighters involved in the attack on Daryl and Mrs. Owens had been formally charged with assault, abuse of power, and harassment. Their trial was set to begin soon, and the anticipation weighed heavily on both mother and son. The legal process was daunting, but they knew this was a necessary step, not only for their own healing, but also to ensure that justice was served and a precedent set for future accountability. On the morning of the trial, Daryl and his mother walked into the courthouse together, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and community members who had come to show their support. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing as they entered, but Daryl focused only on his mother, offering her his arm as they navigated through the crowd. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The accused firefighters sat with their attorneys, their faces a mixture of defiance and nervousness. Daryl couldn't help but notice how different they looked now. Gone were the smug smiles and mocking sneers that had haunted his memory. Now they sat somber, visibly aware of the gravity of their situation. The trial proceeded over several days, with witnesses taking the stand to recount what they had seen that night, their testimonies painting a vivid picture of the cruelty and disregard shown by the firefighters. Video evidence captured by bystanders was played before the court, showing the brutal moments when Mrs. Owens was knocked to the ground by the freezing spray and the firefighters' subsequent attack on Daryl. The footage brought audible gasps from the spectators, and the firefighters' expressions grew increasingly tense as the weight of their actions became undeniable. When it was Daryl's turn to testify, he spoke with unwavering strength, recounting the horror of watching his mother suffer, feeling powerless to protect her, and enduring the assault himself. His words were steady, but filled with the raw pain and anger that he had carried since that night. He wanted the court to understand not only the physical pain, but the emotional toll of watching the people sworn to serve the community use their power to harm rather than help. Mrs. Owens also took the stand, her frail yet resilient voice recounting the fear she had felt and the humiliation of being treated with such disrespect. She described the physical pain, the terror, but also the strength she had found in her son and the community that had stood behind them. Her words moved many in the courtroom to tears, a poignant reminder of the strength and dignity she had shown in the face of cruelty. Finally, after days of emotional testimony and evidence, the trial came to an end. The judge delivered a guilty verdict on all charges, sentencing each firefighter to prison time and mandating that they complete community service as part of their rehabilitation. The courtroom erupted into quiet relief, with many embracing and wiping tears as the verdict sank in. Justice had been served. And as Daryl and his mother left the courthouse, they were greeted by cheers and applause from the crowd waiting outside. People held signs, chanted their names, and offered words of encouragement. Daryl felt a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that the strength of the community had played a crucial role in bringing them to this moment. Over the next few weeks, Daryl and Mrs. Owens focused on healing. Their community continued to support them, offering kindness and assistance and checking in on their recovery. Daryl returned to work, finding solace in his duties as a captain, now even more committed to serving the people and protecting them from any abuse of power. Mrs. Owens, too, found herself slowly regaining her strength, her heart lifted by the knowledge that their story had made a difference. She received letters from people she had never met, sharing their own stories of hardship and thanking her for her bravery. For her, this was the real victory, knowing that her pain had been transformed into a beacon of hope for others. As time passed, the city began to feel the impact of the reforms put in place. The fire department had undergone a transformation, and the policies Mayor Sanders had implemented served as a model for other departments. The incident had not only exposed a grievous wrong, but had also led to meaningful change, sparking conversations and encouraging accountability throughout the city. For Daryl and his mother, life slowly resumed its normal rhythm, though forever touched by the events they had endured. They knew they would always carry the scars, but those scars were now symbols of resilience and courage. Together, they had faced unimaginable cruelty and emerged stronger, their story leaving a lasting impact on the community and serving as a reminder that justice could prevail. In the end, Daryl and Mrs. Owens found peace, knowing that their ordeal had not been in vain. They had stood against the darkness, bringing light and change not only for themselves, but for everyone who believed in the fight for justice and equality. And as they walked side by side through their beloved neighborhood, they knew that, in the end, love and resilience would always triumph. In the end, Mrs. Ruby Owens and her son Captain Darrell Owens found justice. The firefighters who assaulted them faced the consequences of their cruelty, and the city was changed for the better. Their story became a powerful symbol of resilience and the fight for equality. Now their courage inspires others to stand up against injustice everywhere. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, and join us as we continue to tell stories that matter.